Sometimes the lowest point in your life becomes the doorway to your greatest purpose. Stanley Howell knew that feeling well. Standing alone at 48 with his children grown and gone, his business failed, and nothing left but the courage to start again. He bought a crumbling mansion for 50 cents in a forgotten town, where neighbors laughed at his foolishness. But Stanley had his loyal dog Scout and a stubborn belief that broken things could be made whole again. Day after day, they worked through the decay together. Then Scout started pawing at an old pantry wall and wouldn't stop. What Stanley discovered behind it changed everything. A hidden room holding secrets that would transform not just his life, but an entire community that had lost its way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled, and Stanley Howell stared at what 50 cents had bought him. The Fairmont estate rose like a monument to neglect, 3 stories of Victorian grandeur swallowed by ivy and time. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth. The wraparound porch sagged, its ornate railings listing at drunken angles. Scout whined from the passenger seat, his brown eyes questioning. "I know, boy," Stanley said, scratching behind the border collie's ears. "I'm asking myself the same thing." But there was nowhere else to go. Behind them lay the wreckage of his old life, a construction business that had collapsed, a marriage that had withered, an empty house his ex-wife Loretta now shared with her new husband. His daughter Bridget, 26 and teaching 3 states away, had tried to hide her worry. His son Preston, 24 and working abroad, had been more direct. "Dad, are you sure about this?" Stanley wasn't sure about anything anymore, but sitting still felt like drowning. He climbed out, his knees protesting. 48 wasn't old, but the last 2 years had aged him. Scout bounded out, immediately investigating the strange new territory. The town of Millerton spread below the hill, a collection of worn buildings straddling a river that had once powered the textile mill. Population 437, according to the faded sign. Most storefronts on Main Street stood empty, their windows covered with yellowed newspaper. Stanley had learned about Millerton's revival program from a desperate internet search. Towns so economically devastated they were practically giving away historic properties. 50 cents for the deed, plus the promise to maintain the property and pay back taxes in installments. Now, standing in its shadow, Stanley understood why nobody local wanted to touch it. He walked the perimeter first, Scout trotting beside him. The foundation looked solid, thick stone that had weathered more than a century. The roof was another story. Missing shingles revealed dark patches of rot. The back property surprised him. Beyond overgrown gardens, the land stretched for nearly 2 acres. Someone had loved this place once. He could see it in the remnants, stone pathways buried under weeds, the skeleton of a gazebo, raised beds that had once been gardens. The front door hung slightly ajar. Stanley pushed it open slowly, testing the floor before putting his full weight on the entrance hall boards. They held. Scout pressed close to his leg, uncharacteristically cautious. Inside, the decay was both worse and better than imagined. The smell hit him immediately, mold, rot, abandonment. But beneath the ruin, he could see the bones of something magnificent. The entrance hall soared 2 stories high, crowned by a stained-glass skylight so dirty it barely let in light. A grand staircase curved upward, its carved banister intact, despite peeling varnish. He moved through the first floor methodically. Parlor to the left, dining room to the right. Behind them, smaller rooms, library, study, butler's pantry, kitchen, 12-foot ceilings throughout. Original moldings, though many were damaged. 6 fireplaces, all needing inspection. By the time he returned to the first floor, the sun was setting. Scout barked once, sharp and insistent. Stanley turned to find the dog at the entrance to the butler's pantry, tail wagging, looking back as if to say, "Come see." The pantry was narrow and dark, its shelves empty except for dust. But Scout stood at the back wall, sniffing intently at the warped wooden panels. Stanley pulled out his phone, using its flashlight to examine what had caught Scout's attention. Running his hand along the panels, he felt it, a slight gap where there shouldn't be one. He pressed, and the panel shifted inward with a creak that suggested hinges long unused. Behind the panel was darkness, and a locked door. That first night Stanley slept in his truck bed, Scout curled beside him. Through the rear window, he could see the mansion's silhouette against the stars. Somewhere inside was a locked room that had been hidden for years. The thought kept him awake long after exhaustion should have claimed him. The next morning he drove into town. Main Street was more depressing in daylight. But one business showed signs of life. Kirkland's Hardware, its windows displaying tools and supplies that seemed almost defiant in their optimism. A bell chimed when Stanley pushed open the door. Behind the counter stood a man in his 60s, reading glasses perched on his nose. "Help you?" the man said without looking up. "I need some tools. Basic carpentry and renovation supplies to start?" The man looked up, his eyes sharp and assessing. "You must be the fellow who bought the Fairmont place." Word traveled fast in small towns. Stanley nodded. "Stanley Howell, Floyd Kirkland. This is my store." He came around the counter. "Folks are taking bets on how long you last. Most money's on 3 weeks." They spent the next hour assembling a basic toolkit. As Floyd rang up the purchase, he said, "You know anything about the Fairmonts?" "Just what was in the property listing." "Constance Fairmont was the last one," Floyd said, his voice softening. "Good woman. Had ideas about that house. Wanted to do something with it for the community." He shook his head. "Folks didn't listen. After she passed, the house just sat there." "What kind of ideas?" "Teaching center or something. Classes for adults who never got proper education. Constance thought it was never too late to learn." Floyd handed Stanley his receipt. "Town council thought it was foolish. She died before she could make it happen." Stanley thought about the hidden room. "She have any family?" "A cousin. Augustus Pemberton, we call him Gus, runs the post office. He might tell you more if you ask nice." After lunch at Bernice's diner, Stanley drove to the post office. Inside, an elderly man with white hair looked up from a crossword puzzle. "Augustus Pemberton. That's me. Most folks call me Gus." His voice was surprisingly strong. "And you're Stanley Howell, the brave soul who bought Constance's house. I found something in the house yesterday. A hidden room locked. I was hoping you might know something about it." Gus set down his pencil carefully. Constance had her private spaces. She was a thoughtful woman, kept journals, made plans, dreamed big dreams that this town was too small-minded to appreciate. His voice carried decades of regret. "What do you want with that room?" "I'd like to open it." Respectfully. Gus studied Stanley for a long moment, then reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age. "Constance gave this to me years ago. Said if anyone ever came along who genuinely cared about the house, I should pass it on." He held it out. "I think you're that person." Inside was a brass key and a note in elegant handwriting, "For whoever finishes what I started." The sun was setting when Stanley finally returned to the mansion. Standing before the hidden door with Gus's key in hand, Stanley felt exhaustion competing with anticipation. The key turned smoothly. The door swung inward, revealing a small room perhaps 8 feet square. Stanley's phone flashlight illuminated what lay within, and his breath caught. The room was a time capsule, untouched by the decay. A wooden desk sat against one wall. Shelves lined the other walls, filled with leather-bound journals, carefully rolled papers, and wooden boxes. Botanical drawings hung in simple frames. An oil lamp sat on the desk, brass gleaming. Stanley stepped inside, Scout close behind. The air smelled of old paper and lemon oil. Someone, Constance, had sealed this room carefully, preserving it against time. He opened the first journal, and Constance Fairmont's handwriting flowed across the page. The date at the top read April 1989. "Today I met with the town council again. They still don't understand. A community that stops learning, stops living." Stanley read entry after entry, watching Constance's dream take shape. She'd planned everything. Classroom layouts, curriculum for adult learners, a library open to all. She'd written to state education departments, seeking grants and support. She'd drafted a charter establishing the house as a community learning center. The rejection letters were there too. Polite dismissals from town councils, school boards, state agencies. But Constance had persisted. The journals spanned nearly a decade, filled with refinements to her plans. The final journal entry was dated October 1998. "I'm not strong enough anymore. My dream will die with me unless someone comes along who understands. Someday, someone will find these journals and see what I saw. A house full of potential, a community that needs healing, and the simple truth that it's never too late to learn, to grow, to become more than you were. Someone will finish this. I have faith." Stanley closed the journal gently, his throat tight. Scout leaned against his leg, offering silent comfort. He'd come to Millerton looking for a place to hide from his failures. Instead, he'd found someone else's unfulfilled dreams waiting in a locked room. Stanley looked at Scout, who gazed back with absolute trust. "What do you think, boy? Should we finish what she started?" Scout's tail wagged once, decisive. Stanley gathered the journals carefully. He'd read more tonight, learn everything Constance had planned. Then tomorrow, he'd start figuring out if one broken man and his dog could accomplish what a determined woman hadn't lived long enough to see. But Constance's words echoed in his mind. It's never too late to learn, to grow, to become more than you were. Maybe, across the gap of death and time, she'd somehow written it for a failed contractor named Stanley Howell, who would arrive almost 30 years later, searching for a reason to hope again. 3 weeks of sunrise to sunset work had transformed the mansion's exterior from embarrassment to merely shabby. Stanley had patched the roof, replaced broken windows, and cleared enough ivy that the house's bones were finally visible. His hands were calloused, his back ached each morning, but his mind felt clearer than it had in years. Scout had settled into renovation life, appointing himself supervisor of all projects. He'd bark warnings when Stanley climbed too high on ladders and spend afternoons napping in patches of sunlight. This particular morning started like all the others. Stanley woke before dawn in the former library, now his makeshift bedroom. Constance's journals were stacked neatly on his card table desk. He'd read them all now, absorbing her vision until it felt like his own. He made coffee on the camping stove, watching the sun rise over Millerton's rooftops. Scout appeared at his elbow, whining softly, not his usual hungry whine or squirrel alert. This was different, insistent, almost anxious. "What's wrong, boy?" Scout trotted toward the butler's pantry, looking back to make sure Stanley followed. They'd been in that pantry dozens of times since discovering the hidden room. But Scout stopped at the entrance now, ears forward, every line of his body radiating attention. "Scout, we've been here before. There's nothing—" The dog barked once, sharp and commanding, then entered the narrow space. Instead of going to the hidden door they'd already opened, Scout moved to the back wall, the actual back wall of the pantry. Stanley followed, confused. He'd examined these walls when he first explored the house. They were solid, part of the original construction. But Scout was pawing at the warped wooden panels with the same focused intensity he'd shown 3 weeks ago. "Boy, that's just—" Stanley stopped. In the early morning light filtering through the pantry's high window, he could see something he'd missed before. The wood grain didn't quite match. Where the rest of the pantry showed regular vertical lines, this section had been patched. He ran his hands along the panels, pressing gently. Nothing moved. He tried pushing harder, and then he felt it. Not a give in the wood itself, but a slight vibration, as if there was empty space behind instead of solid wall. Stanley retrieved a crowbar and returned to the pantry. The first board came away easily once he found its edge. Behind it was darkness and the smell of stale air. He removed 3 more boards, creating an opening large enough to squeeze through. Another room, smaller than Constance's archive, but similarly preserved. And it had been deliberately concealed, the access boarded over and painted to blend with the surrounding wall. Stanley's heart raced. Whatever was in there, someone had wanted it hidden, not just closed off like Constance's room, but truly concealed. He squeezed through the opening, feet finding solid floor on the other side. The room was roughly 6 feet square. Cardboard boxes were stacked against one wall. A small filing cabinet sat in the corner, and on the floor, protected by a tarp, lay rolled papers and architectural drawings. He started with the filing cabinet. The first drawer held financial records, receipts, invoices, bank statements, all dated from the mid-1990s, all related to the Fairmont estate. Stanley flipped through them, recognizing renovation expenses, material purchases, contractor quotes. Constance had been getting cost estimates for her learning center. The numbers made Stanley wince. Even 25 years ago, the renovation would have cost nearly $200,000. The second drawer held correspondence, letters to contractors, architects, grant foundations, and tucked in the back, a large manila envelope labeled Final Plans. Stanley opened it carefully. Inside were professional architectural drawings, far more detailed than the sketches in Constance's journals. Someone had taken her vision and translated it into technical specifications. The architect's stamp was dated July 1997. Constance had been more serious about this than even her journals suggested. She'd moved beyond dreaming into actual planning, spending money she probably couldn't spare on professional designs. The cardboard boxes held teaching materials, textbooks, workbooks, lesson plan templates, equipment catalogs with items circled. All the physical pieces needed to run a learning center, researched and itemized. And at the bottom of the last box, Stanley found a leather folder embossed with gold lettering, the Constance Fairmont Community Learning Center, Mission and Charter. Inside was a formal document, typed and bound, outlining the center's purpose, governance structure, and operating principles. The preamble made Stanley's throat tighten. We hold that learning is a fundamental human right, not bound by age or circumstance. This center exists to serve those whom formal education failed, to provide dignity and opportunity to all who seek growth. The governance section detailed how the center would be managed. A 7-member board elected by participants, with term limits and transparent decision-making. Most striking was a section titled Property Transfer. It specified that the Fairmont estate, upon establishment of the Learning Center and 1 year of successful operation, would be transferred to a non-profit trust. Constance had been planning to give away her family home. A loose paper fell from the folder, a handwritten note on Constance's stationery, dated October 15th, 1998. To whoever finds this, if you're reading these words, my dream found you. These plans are complete. The money is gone, spent on designs and preparations, but the vision remains. If you have the courage to try, if you believe broken things can be healed, then this is your path. The house is yours legally, but morally it belongs to everyone. Make it serve its purpose. I won't see it happen, but knowing someone will finish this brings me comfort. Build it, open the doors, let them learn. Someone will finish what I started. I have faith. Constance Fairmont. Stanley sat on the dusty floor, the letter in his hands, Scout pressing against his side. Around him, in boxes and folders and carefully preserved documents, lay the complete blueprint for transforming this mansion into exactly what Constance had envisioned. She'd done everything except live long enough to see it through. The weight of that realization settled over Stanley. He hadn't just bought a house for 50 cents. He'd inherited a responsibility, a trust placed by a dead woman who somehow knew that someday someone would care enough to try. His phone buzzed, a text from Bridget. "How's the house project going?" Stanley looked around the hidden room, at the evidence of Constance's determination and faith. He typed back, "Found something important. We'll call tonight." But he knew the real answer was more complicated. Was he still alive? In some ways, more alive than he'd been in years. Stanley gathered the documents carefully, carrying them to join Constance's journals in the library. Scout followed, his tail wagging in approval, as if to say he'd known all along that the real discovery wasn't the first hidden room, but this second one. Outside, Millerton was waking up. Stanley could hear distant sounds of traffic, see smoke rising from chimneys. The town had no idea what was coming, because Stanley Howell had just decided something that would have seemed impossible a month ago. He was going to build Constance's Learning Center. Not just honor her memory, Actually build it, make it real, open those doors just as she dreamed. He had no idea if he could succeed where she had failed. But he had something Constance hadn't, her complete plans and the knowledge that she'd believed someone would come along who could finish what she started. Stanley opened his laptop and began making lists, translating Constance's vision into actionable steps. Scout settled at his feet, content now that his human had found what needed finding. 3 weeks ago, Scout had started pawing at a wall. Now Stanley's entire future had changed direction. The question was whether that future would become triumph or simply another noble failure added to his collection. Only time would tell. But for the first time since his business collapsed, Stanley felt something he'd almost forgotten. Purpose, and purpose could sustain a man through a lot of doubt. The morning after discovering Constance's complete plans, Stanley spread the architectural drawings across the cleared dining room floor. Scout supervised from the doorway, having learned that paper on floors meant his human needed concentration. The scope of work was staggering. The electrical system alone needed complete replacement. The original wiring was a fire hazard. Plumbing throughout the house was corroded beyond repair. The foundation showed stress cracks that needed attention before any cosmetic work made sense. Stanley pulled out his notebook and started calculating costs. Wire, conduit, outlets, switches, breakers, PVC pipe, fixtures, insulation, drywall. His savings account could maybe cover a quarter of the materials needed, assuming he did all the labor himself. The enormity of the task pressed down on him. Constance had spent years trying to fund this project and died before raising enough money. What made him think he could do better? Scout whined softly, sensing his discouragement. I know, boy. We can't quit before we start. Stanley looked at the drawings again, searching for ways to break the project into manageable phases. One room at a time. That's how you eat an elephant, right? He decided to start with the front parlor, a single room that could serve as proof of concept. If he could transform one space completely, show what was possible, maybe others would begin to believe. The hardware store was busy when Stanley arrived. Lloyd was helping an older woman select paint colors. Stanley browsed the electrical supplies, making notes on what he'd need for the parlor's rewiring. Ambitious project you're taking on, Floyd said, appearing at his elbow once the store had emptied. He looked at Stanley's list. Rewiring the whole house? Just one room to start. The front parlor. I figure if I can do one right, it's a template for the rest. Floyd nodded slowly. Smart. Most folks bite off more than they can chew. He pulled out a calculator. This list runs about $400. I can give you contractor pricing, knock off 15%. I appreciate that. What are you really doing with that house? Floyd's eyes were sharp, but not unkind. And don't tell me you're just fixing it up to sell. Stanley decided honesty might be his best tool. I found 2 hidden rooms. The first had Constance's journals. The second had complete plans for turning the mansion into a community learning center. Floyd's expression shifted. A learning center. Free classes for adults. Basic education, practical skills, whatever the community needs. Constance designed the whole thing but never got to build it. I'm thinking maybe I can finish what she started. The hardware store was silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Floyd walked to the front window, staring out at Millerton's empty main street. My wife Eileen taught adult literacy at the mill, he said quietly, before it closed. She had 15 students, men and women who'd never learned to read properly. Some could barely sign their own names. He turned back to Stanley. She died 8 years ago. Cancer, but she used to talk about how much those classes mattered. I'm sorry about your wife. Constance came to Eileen once. Asked her to help with the learning center plan. Eileen was excited, said it was exactly what the town needed. Then Constance died, and the whole idea died with her. Floyd walked back to the counter. If you're serious about this, really serious, I'll help. Not just with discounts. With work? Stanley felt something shift in his chest. I can't pay you. Didn't ask for payment. Asked if you were serious. I am. Floyd extended his hand. Then we've got a deal. I'll come by this weekend, help you with that rewiring. At the diner, Bernice brought coffee without being asked. Stanley had been coming in for breakfast every morning, and she'd learned his preferences. "You look less tired than usual," she observed. "Good news." "Maybe. Floyd's going to help with the renovation." Bernice's eyebrows rose. "Floyd doesn't help anybody these days." She paused. "What did you say to him?" Stanley told her about Constance's plans, watching Bernice's face carefully. Her expression went from interested to moved to something like hope. "A learning center?" she repeated. "Free classes. That's the idea, if I can pull it off. When I was young, this town had evening classes at the high school. My mother learned to sew there, my father learned bookkeeping. After the mill closed, the school cut all those programs." Bernice sat down across from him. "You know what kills a town? Not poverty. It's when people stop believing they can be anything other than what they are." Constance understood that. She was ahead of her time. Bernice stood up. "I can cook. Not fancy, but good solid food. If you get this center running, I'll teach cooking classes. Budget meals, nutrition. Lord knows half this town lives on frozen dinners and despair." Stanley found himself smiling. "I'd be honored to have you. 2 allies. Not an army, but it was a start." That evening, Stanley called Bridget. He told her everything. Scout's discovery, the hidden rooms, Constance's complete plans, his decision to build the learning center. As he talked, he realized how insane it all sounded. A failed contractor buying a ruined mansion for 50 cents and deciding to honor a dead woman's dream. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Stanley wondered if the connection had dropped. "Bridget." "I'm here. Dad, this is either the best decision you've ever made or the most like you used to be." Her voice softened. "Before the business got bad, you used to talk about building things that mattered. Community centers, affordable housing, projects with purpose instead of just profit. I missed that version of you." Stanley's throat tightened. "I missed him too. Can you really do this? Financially, I mean. Honestly, I don't know. It's going to take money I don't have and help from people who mostly think I'm crazy." But Constance left complete plans. "What can I do?" The question surprised him. "You'd help? Dad, you just told me you're building a free learning center because your dog found a secret room. This is the most interesting thing you've done in 5 years. Of course I'll help." They talked for another hour, Bridget suggesting practical steps, establishing social media presence, researching grants, documenting the renovation process. Her enthusiasm fed his own. After hanging up, Stanley sat on the mansion's front porch, Scout beside him, watching the sun set over Millerton. Footsteps on the gravel drive made Scout's ears perk up. An elderly man was climbing the hill, moving slowly but steadily. Gus Pemberton, Constance's cousin. "Evening," Gus called out. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. Please join me." Gus settled onto the porch steps with a soft grunt. "The house looks better. You've been working hard." "Trying to. Floyd mentioned you found Constance's plans. Her real plans, the professional ones. You knew about them." "I knew she'd spent money she couldn't afford on architects and designs. I told her she was being foolish." Gus's voice carried regret. "I should have supported her. The hidden room with the plans was sealed off. She never meant for you to know she kept going." "That sounds like Constance." Gus pulled an envelope from his jacket. "I'm 83 years old. Before I go, I'd like to know that Constance's dream came true, even if she never saw it." He handed Stanley the envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000. "Mr. Pemberton, I can't. You can and you will. It's money I should have given Constance 30 years ago." Gus stood. "I'll be by tomorrow. I want to see those plans properly, help however I can." He walked away before Stanley could respond, disappearing down the hill into the gathering darkness. Stanley looked at the check in his hands, then at Scout. 3 allies and $5,000. "We might actually do this, boy." Scout's tail wagged agreement. Inside, Stanley added Gus's name to his growing list of supporters. 3 people didn't seem like much against a town of 400 who thought he was wasting his time. But it was 3 more than he'd had at the start of the week. And Constance had started with just herself and a dream. Stanley opened one of her journals and read, "Great things rarely begin with crowds. They begin with one person who refuses to accept that good ideas should die just because they're difficult. He closed the journal and returned to his architectural drawings, while scouts slept and the old house creaked around them, no longer a tomb of abandoned dreams, but slowly becoming something that might just change everything. 2 months into the renovation, Stanley had established a rhythm that felt almost like the life he'd once known. Purposeful work, tangible progress, problems that could be solved with planning and effort. The front parlor was nearly complete, its new wiring hidden behind fresh drywall, windows that actually closed, and floors that no longer threatened to collapse. Gus had become a regular presence, arriving most afternoons with sandwiches from the diner and stories about Millerton's better days. He'd brought something else too, a photograph album bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed but its contents preserved. "Constance kept this," Gus explained, settling into the one decent chair Stanley had salvaged. Pictures of the town from the 50s through the 80s. She wanted to remember what we were, hoped we might become it again. Stanley opened the album carefully. The first photograph showed the mansion in its glory, white paint gleaming, gardens manicured, people gathered on the lawn for what looked like a summer party. Men in suits, women in dresses, children playing. That was 1955, Gus said. My uncle, Constance's father, hosted community gatherings here every month. Town meetings, celebrations, fundraisers. This house was the heart of Millerton. Stanley turned the pages slowly. More photographs, the textile mill in full operation, smoke rising from its stacks. Main Street bustling with shoppers. The old schoolhouse with children spilling out its doors. A 4th of July parade with half the town marching. We had nearly 2,000 people then, Gus continued. The mill employed 600. We had 3 churches, 2 schools, a hospital. What happened? The mill got bought by a corporation that decided labor was cheaper overseas. They closed us down in 1985, promised it was temporary. That was 40 years ago. Gus's voice carried the weight of decades. People left, young folks especially. Those of us who stayed just watched the town die one boarded window at a time. Stanley studied a photograph from 1978, the mansion hosting what appeared to be an adult education class. 15 people sat in what was now the gutted dining room, books open. That was Constance's mother, Gus said. She taught basic literacy twice a week, free for anyone who wanted to learn. After she died, Constance tried to continue it, but by then people were too defeated to care about reading. The album became Stanley's evening reading. Each photograph was a window into what Millerton had been, what Constance had been trying to restore. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Stanley was replacing rotten boards on the back porch when a pickup truck pulled into the drive. 2 men climbed out, one perhaps 60, built like someone who'd done physical labor his entire life. The other younger, maybe 45. Floyd emerged from Stanley's truck. "Stanley, this is Dwight Saunders and Percy Calhoun. They want to talk to you." Dwight extended a calloused hand. "Floyd's been telling us about your project. The Learning Center. Word travels fast. Small town," Percy said. "Not much else to talk about except what the crazy outsider is doing." Stanley waited, unsure if he was about to be mocked or threatened. "I'm a mason," Dwight said. "Was, anyway. Retired now. Floyd says you need foundation work done. I had a look at the south side. You've got significant settling. If you don't address it, you'll have worse problems come spring." "I know. I've been putting it off because I can't afford—" "I'm not asking for money," Dwight interrupted. "I'm offering help. I've got time and tools. What I don't have is anything useful to do with my days." Percy shifted his weight. "I was foreman at the mill, 30 years. When it closed, I was 50. Too young for retirement, too old for anyone to hire. I've been doing odd jobs ever since." He met Stanley's eyes. "Floyd says if this learning center happens, you might teach classes. Construction skills. That's the plan, eventually. I want to learn. Never had formal training, just picked things up on the job. Always figured I was too old to bother with education." Percy's jaw tightened. "But I've got a granddaughter. She's 19, working at a gas station because there's nothing here. If this place becomes what Constance wanted, Maybe she'd come back. Maybe she could learn something that gives her a real future. Stanley felt the moment's significance. These weren't just offers of help, they were acts of faith. "I'd be honored to have your help," Stanley said. "Both of you. And Percy, when we're ready to open, you'll be the first person I ask to help teach. Someone with 30 years of practical experience? That's exactly what we need." Dwight grinned. "When do we start?" "How about now?" They worked through the afternoon. 4 men and a dog, excavating around the foundation's damaged section, mixing concrete, reinforcing the stonework. Stanley noticed something he hadn't felt since his business collapsed: camaraderie. Bernice arrived at lunch with enough food for an army. She surveyed the work crew with approval. "About time this town remembered how to come together," she said. "Constance would be so proud." After lunch, Gus arrived with a surprise, a younger man carrying a toolbox. "This is my nephew's son, Marvin Oakes," Gus announced. "He's an electrician. Licensed and everything. Works in the city, but he's willing to come out weekends to help with the wiring." Marvin shook Stanley's hand firmly. "Uncle Gus showed me Constance's plans. My grandmother was in those photographs. She attended classes here in the 60s. This place meant something to my family. I'd like to help bring it back." By sunset, Stanley had gone from working alone to supervising a team of 5 volunteers. They gathered on the front porch afterward, drinking water and surveying the day's progress. "We need a name," Floyd said suddenly. "Can't just be those folks working on the Fairmont place?" They debated options, but Percy shook his head. "We're not just restoring a building. We're restoring hope. That's bigger than any name." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over Millerton. Stanley felt a lump in his throat. A month ago, he'd been alone, except for Scout. Now he was surrounded by people who believed in something bigger than themselves. His phone rang. Bridget's number. He answered, walking a short distance from the group. "Dad, I've been researching grants for community education projects. There's a state program that funds rural learning centers. Applications are due in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. We're nowhere near ready. You don't have to be ready. You just have to show potential. Take pictures of the work. Document Constance's plans. Get letters of support. Show them this isn't just renovation, it's revival." After the call, Stanley returned to find his volunteers in animated discussion about classes and schedules. Floyd wanted to teach basic home repair. Dwight could handle masonry. Percy knew carpentry. Bernice had her cooking classes. Marvin could teach electrical safety. "We're planning like it's already happening," Floyd said, almost sheepishly. "No," Stanley said firmly. "You're doing exactly what Constance did, believing in it so hard that it has to become real. Keep planning, keep believing. That's what makes this work." Gus pulled Stanley aside as the others packed up. "You know there'll be opposition, don't you? Not everyone in Millerton wants to see this succeed." "Why not?" "Because success means they were wrong to give up. Means they let Constance die thinking her dream was impossible, when maybe it just needed someone with fresh eyes." Gus's expression was serious. "Some folks prefer their despair familiar. Hope makes them uncomfortable." Stanley filed that information away. He'd deal with opposition when it came. That night, alone with Scout, Stanley updated Constance's journal. "You weren't alone at the end," he wrote. "You had Gus, even if you didn't share everything with him. You had people who remembered your mother's classes. They just didn't know how to help. I'm luckier. I have your plans and people willing to try. We're going to finish this. I promise." He closed the journal and looked at Scout. "Tomorrow we start on the 2nd room. 1 room at a time, until this whole house is alive again." Scout's tail wagged once. Approval, agreement, and faith. Outside, Millerton slept under autumn stars, unaware that in the mansion on the hill a quiet revolution was beginning. Not loud or dramatic, but steady as the work of hands and hearts aligned toward a common purpose. 4 months into the renovation, the mansion had crossed an invisible threshold from ruin to possibility. 3 rooms on the 1st floor were fully restored, their original character preserved, while modern systems hummed safely behind the walls. The entryway had been cleared and repaired, its stained glass skylight cleaned until it threw colored light across refinished floors. Visitors no longer stepped carefully, testing each board. They walked with confidence through spaces that welcomed rather than warned. Stanley discovered Constance's lesson plans on a cold November morning. He'd been organizing materials in what would become the library when he found a cedar chest tucked beneath a window seat. Inside, wrapped in protective cloth, were a dozen spiral-bound notebooks labeled by subject and skill level. He opened the first one. Introduction to Financial Literacy, Adult Learners. Constance's handwriting filled every page with meticulous care. Each lesson built on the previous one, starting with basic concepts, understanding a paycheck, creating a budget, and progressing to more complex topics like credit, savings, and retirement planning. But what struck Stanley most was her tone. Every instruction emphasized dignity and respect. Remember, your students are not ignorant, they are inexperienced. There is profound difference between the two. The other notebooks covered carpentry, gardening, local history, reading comprehension, and basic mathematics. Each one was a masterpiece of patient pedagogy, designed for adults who'd been failed by formal education or never had access to it. Stanley sat on the dusty floor, reading through lesson after lesson, marveling at the depth of Constance's preparation. She hadn't just dreamed of a learning center. She'd created an entire curriculum, ready to be implemented the moment she found willing teachers. "We can use these," he said aloud, and Scout, supervising from the doorway, barked agreement. That evening, Stanley called a meeting of what the volunteers had started calling the Fairmont Project. 7 people gathered in the restored front parlor. Floyd, Gus, Dwight, Percy, Bernice, Marvin, and a new addition, Phyllis Drummond, the town librarian. Phyllis was perhaps 55, with grey hair pulled into a practical bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She'd approached Stanley at the diner 2 weeks ago with an offer he couldn't refuse. "The county's closing our library," she'd explained, her voice steady despite obvious distress. "Budget cuts. They say we can access the regional library system online, as if everyone here has reliable internet." She'd looked at him directly. "I heard you're building a learning center. I have 8,000 books with nowhere to go. Would you want them?" No, those books were stacked in the room that would become the library, waiting to be catalogued and shelved. Phyllis had volunteered to manage the collection and teach reading groups once the center opened. Stanley shared Constance's lesson plans with the group, watching their faces as they read. "This is comprehensive," Floyd said, flipping through the carpentry notebook. "She's got projects here I haven't thought about in years. Dovetail joints, mortise and tenon, real craftsmanship. The gardening curriculum includes soil composition, companion planting, and season extension," Bernice noted. "This isn't just put seeds in ground and hope." She was teaching sustainable food production. Gus's eyes were wet as he read the local history outline. She documented everything. The founding families, the mill's history, the way industries changed the landscape. "This is our story preserved. We could actually teach from these," Percy said slowly. "Start classes right away, soon as the rooms are ready." Stanley had been hoping someone would make that connection. "That's what I'm thinking. We're not ready to open officially, but we could do a pilot program. Invite a few people, test the curriculum, work out logistics." "How few is few?" Dwight asked. "Maybe 10 to 15 participants. 1 or 2 classes to start. Keep it manageable while we're still renovating." Phyllis raised her hand slightly, a teacher's habit. "If you're doing pilot classes, you need to announce it. Let people know this is happening. Otherwise, you're just having private gatherings in a construction site." "She's right," Gus agreed. "People need to see this is real. The more we hide it, the more suspicious folks get." They spent the next hour planning. Floyd would teach basic home repair starting in January, just 8 weeks away. The class would meet once a week for 6 weeks, covering everything from fixing leaky faucets to patching drywall. Bernice would teach budget cooking, also 6 weeks, focusing on nutritious meals from inexpensive ingredients. "We'll need to register people somehow," Marvin pointed out. "Know who's coming? Make sure we have enough materials." Stanley volunteered to create a simple registration system, forms at the diner, hardware store, and post office. No fees for Millerton residents, as Constance had specified. A modest charge for people from neighboring towns to help cover materials. "What about opposition?" Percy asked. Gus mentioned Vaughan Pritchard's been making noise. Stanley had been trying to ignore that problem, but it wouldn't ignore him. Pritchard had started attending town council meetings, speaking against what he called unauthorized development at the Fairmont estate. He'd raised questions about insurance, liability, proper permits, all legitimate concerns, but delivered with an edge that suggested his real objection was philosophical, not procedural. "We'll need to incorporate as a non-profit," Phyllis said. She was the most educated person in the group, with a master's degree in library science. "Establish a board, file proper paperwork, get insurance, make everything legal and transparent. That costs money," Floyd noted. "I know a lawyer," Gus said quietly. "In the city. He handles non-profit formations. I'll talk to him, see if he'll work pro bono." This is exactly the kind of project he supports. The meeting concluded with assignments. Gus would contact the lawyer, Phyllis would draft initial bylaws, Stanley would create registration materials, and everyone would spread word about the pilot classes. As people filed out into the November cold, Bernice lingered. "You know what you're doing, don't you? You're making this real. Once those classes start, this stops being Stanley's project and becomes the town's. That's smart. That's what Constance wanted. Community ownership, not individual control. It also means you can't back out gracefully if things get hard. Once people depend on this place, you're committed." Stanley looked around the restored parlor, its fresh paint, new lighting, comfortable chairs arranged in a welcoming circle. "I'm already committed. Have been since Scout found that first hidden room." After Bernice left, Stanley sat alone, reviewing the notes from the meeting. Everything was moving faster than he'd anticipated. 4 months ago, he'd been clearing debris and wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Now he had volunteers, lesson plans, books, and a schedule for actual classes. His phone buzzed, a text from Bridget. "Grant application submitted." Fingers crossed. "Also, I'm coming for Thanksgiving. Want to see this place in person." Stanley smiled. Thanksgiving was 2 weeks away. By then, he'd have another room finished. The dining room where he imagined hosting a meal for his small but growing team of believers. The next morning brought an unwelcome visitor. Stanley was installing shelving in the library when he heard an expensive engine in the driveway. Through the window, he watched a sleek black SUV park, and a man in his 50s climbed out, well-dressed, confident, the kind of person who expected doors to open before he reached them. Vaughan Pritchard had come calling. Stanley met him at the front door, Scout at his side. The dog's hackles were slightly raised. He'd always been a good judge of character. "Mr. Howell." Pritchard's smile was professionally warm, but didn't reach his eyes. "I thought it was time we met properly. I'm Vaughan Pritchard. I own several properties in Millerton. I know who you are. May I come in? I'd like to see what you're doing with the place." Stanley considered refusing, but curiosity won. He stepped aside, and Pritchard entered, his expensive shoes clicking on the refinished floors. His gaze swept the space professionally, cataloguing every detail. "Impressive work," Pritchard said, and he sounded genuine. "You've done more in 4 months than I expected anyone could do in a year. This place was a disaster. It had good bones. Just needed care." Pritchard walked through the first floor, pausing at each restored room. At the library, he studied the stacks of books waiting to be shelved. "You're serious about this learning center concept?" "Completely serious. Can I speak candidly, Mr. Howell?" "Stanley." "And yes." Pritchard leaned against the doorframe, his posture casual but his words calculated. "Millerton is dying. Has been for 30 years. What this town needs isn't education. It's economic development. Jobs, investment, reasons for young people to stay or return. I'm working to create that. High-end vacation rentals, a boutique hotel, farm-to-table restaurants. Turn this place into a destination. By tearing down historic buildings. By repurposing them. Adaptive reuse. It's sustainable and profitable." Pritchard's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your project competes with that vision. A functioning community center, people learning skills. developing expectations. It makes residents harder to relocate, properties harder to acquire. That sounds like a reason to support what I'm doing. Not oppose it. I'm not opposing you. I'm offering to buy you out. $50,000 for the property, plus $10,000 for your renovation work. That's generous considering you paid 50 cents. Stanley had expected this conversation eventually, but not so soon. Not interested. 75,000. Final offer. Mr. Pritchard, this house isn't for sale at any price. It's going to become exactly what Constance Fairmont intended. A place where people can learn, grow, and remember what community means. Pritchard's professional warmth evaporated. You're making a mistake. This town doesn't want what you're offering. They want jobs and money, not feel-good classes that won't pay their bills. Then let them decide. I'm not forcing anyone to participate. No, but you're standing in the way of real progress. And I have friends on the town council, contacts with the county planning office. I can make operating here very difficult for you. Pritchard headed for the door, pausing at the threshold. Think about my offer. $75,000 to walk away from a project that's probably going to fail anyway. That's more than pride should cost. He left without waiting for a response, his SUV spitting gravel as he accelerated down the drive. Stanley stood in the doorway, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from anger. Scout pressed against his leg, offering comfort. He's wrong, Stanley said aloud. This place is going to succeed. Not because I need it to, but because Constance deserves it. Because people like Floyd and Bernice and Gus deserve it. Because this town deserves one more chance to remember who they used to be. That evening, he called an emergency meeting. When he explained Pritchard's visit and veiled threats, the response surprised him. Floyd laughed. Bond's been threatening to buy my hardware store for 5 years. I'm still here. He tried to buy the diner too, Bernice added. Wanted to turn it into a wine bar. I told him where he could put his wine. The man's all talk, Dwight said. Let him file complaints. We'll make sure everything's done right. Permits, inspections, insurance. He'll have nothing legitimate to complain about. Gus nodded slowly. Vaughn represents a certain kind of progress. Profit-driven, outsider-focused, treating the town like a commodity. You represent something else. Community-driven, resident-focused, treating the town like home. Both can't win. Then we'd better make sure we do, Percy said firmly. Stanley looked around at these people who'd become more than volunteers. They'd become partners in something that mattered. Thank you, all of you, for believing in this. We're not doing it for you, Floyd said gruffly. We're doing it for us, for Constance, for what Millerton used to be and might be again. After everyone left, Stanley returned to Constance's hidden room, the first one Scout had discovered. He opened her final journal, reading her last entry once more. Someone will finish this. I have faith. Your faith wasn't misplaced, he whispered. We're going to make this happen. Pritchard, opposition, obstacles, none of it matters. You started something that refuses to die. Now it's our job to bring it fully to life. Scout barked once, a sound of agreement and determination. Outside, winter was coming to Millerton. But inside the mansion, something was growing that no cold could touch. The stubborn, persistent warmth of people who decided that hope was worth fighting for. 5 months after Stanley's arrival, winter settled over Millerton with quiet determination. Snow covered the mansion's grounds, softening its edges and making the restored portions look almost magical against the white landscape. Inside, Stanley worked by space heater and determination, pushing to complete enough rooms for the pilot classes scheduled to begin in 3 weeks. He'd found another treasure among Constance's papers, a weathered document titled Community Charter for the Constance Fairmont Learning Center. It wasn't just governance guidelines. It was a philosophy written with the precision of someone who'd thought deeply about how people learn and grow together. The principles were simple but profound. Every person brings value regardless of education level. Learning is collaborative, not hierarchical. Dignity matters more than speed. Mistakes are part of growth, not signs of failure. Community needs guide curriculum, not predetermined assumptions about what people should know. Stanley had the charter framed and hung in the entryway, where anyone entering would see it first. These weren't just nice words, they were the foundation of everything Constance had envisioned. Thanksgiving arrived with unexpected warmth. Bridget drove up from 3 states away, arriving late Wednesday afternoon. Stanley heard her car and stepped onto the porch, Scout racing ahead to greet her. His daughter climbed out, staring at the mansion with an expression Stanley couldn't quite read. Then she looked at him and smiled. A real smile, the kind he hadn't seen from her in years. "Dad, this is incredible." He showed her everything. The restored rooms with their careful balance of preservation and practicality. The library taking shape, with Phyllis's donated books waiting on new shelves. Constance's hidden rooms, the journals, the lesson plans. The workshop space where Floyd would teach home repair. The kitchen where Bernice would conduct cooking classes. Bridget read Constance's journals in silence, occasionally wiping her eyes. When she finished, she looked at Stanley with something like awe. "You found your purpose. I think it found me. Scout gets the credit." "No, Dad, you could have cleared this place, fixed the basics, and flipped it for profit. Instead, you chose to honor a dead woman's dream. That's character, not luck." That evening, Stanley hosted Thanksgiving dinner in the partially restored dining room. The table was mismatched chairs and boards on sawhorses, but Bernice had prepared a feast. Floyd brought wine. Gus brought his famous apple pie. Dwight and Percy arrived together, having become unlikely friends. Phyllis came with her adult son, who'd driven from the city to meet the people his mother wouldn't stop talking about. Marvin brought his wife and their 2 children, who explored the mansion with squeals of delight. 14 people crowded around the makeshift table, passing food and stories in equal measure. Stanley looked at their faces. Most of them had been strangers 5 months ago. Now they felt like family. "We should say something," Bernice suggested. "Acknowledge what we're grateful for." They went around the table. Floyd was grateful for purpose after years of routine. Dwight was grateful for hands that still worked and projects that mattered. Percy was grateful that his granddaughter had called last week, interested in what he was building. Phyllis was grateful her books would live on, serving the purpose she'd always intended. When it came to Gus, the old man's voice cracked. "I'm grateful Constance's dream didn't die with her. I'm grateful Stanley was stubborn enough to honor it. And I'm grateful to be alive to see it happen." Bridget squeezed her father's hand when his turn came. "I'm grateful for second chances," Stanley said simply, "and for people generous enough to believe in them." After dinner, while others played cards and the children chased Scout through empty rooms, Bridget pulled Stanley aside. "I've been thinking about what you said, about needing help with social media and documentation. What if I moved here? Not permanently, but for 6 months. I can work remotely, and I could run your outreach efforts, build community support, document everything." Stanley stared at his daughter. "You do that?" "Dad, I teach 3rd graders. It's fine work, but it's not changing anything fundamental. This," she gestured at the mansion, the people gathered in its rooms, "this is changing everything. I want to be part of it. What about your life there?" "My apartment lease ends in January. My school can find substitute teachers. And honestly, I've been looking for a reason to try something different. You just gave me one." Stanley hugged his daughter, overcome with gratitude and relief. He'd been managing everything alone, the renovation, the planning, the paperwork, the opposition. Having Bridget here would change everything. The next morning, Bridget started documenting. She photographed every room, interviewed each volunteer, and reviewed all of Constance's papers. By Sunday, she'd created a basic website and social media presence for what they were officially calling the Constance Fairmont Community Learning Center. "You need to start thinking bigger," she told Stanley over coffee. "This isn't just a local project anymore. People are interested. I've had inquiries from 3 other dying mill towns asking how they could replicate this model. We haven't even opened yet. Doesn't matter. The story is compelling. Failed contractor honors a dead woman's dream, rebuilds community 1 class at a time. That's the kind of narrative people want to support." She was right. By the end of the week, the center's social media following had grown to 2,000 people. Donations started arriving, $50 here, $100 there. Nothing huge, but it added up. More importantly, Millerton residents were paying attention. Registration for the pilot classes filled within 48 hours. Floyd's home repair class had 15 participants. Bernice's cooking class had 12. Stanley had to create waiting lists. But success brought scrutiny. A week after registration closed, Stanley received a visit from Millerton's building inspector, a harried man named Morris Sheffield, who'd been doing this job for 20 years. "Got a complaint," Morris said, not unkindly. "Someone reported you're operating a school without proper permits." "We're not a school. We're a community education center operating as a non-profit. That's a distinction without a difference, far as the code's concerned. You're having regular gatherings of people for educational purposes in a structure that needs to meet specific safety standards." Morris spent 3 hours inspecting the building. He found violations, not major ones, but enough to prevent opening. The emergency exits needed proper signage and lighting. Fire extinguishers were required in every room. The kitchen needed commercial-grade equipment if food was being prepared. Occupancy limits needed to be posted. "This is all fixable," Morris said, handing Stanley a written list. "But until it's done, you can't legally operate." He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I think what you're doing is good. My wife's signed up for the cooking class, but I've got to enforce the code." Stanley looked at the list. Estimated cost, $4,000. Money he didn't have. That evening, he sat with Bridget in the library, both of them silent. Outside, snow fell steadily, covering everything in cold white. "We could postpone the pilot classes," Bridget suggested. "Give ourselves time to raise funds. If we postpone, we lose momentum. People will think we can't deliver, that this is just talk. Can we afford not to postpone?" Stanley didn't answer. The truth was, he'd spent nearly all his savings on materials and basic necessities. Gus's $5,000 was long gone. The donations from social media barely covered utilities and insurance. His phone rang, an unfamiliar number. He answered to find Stanford Whitley, the lawyer Gus had connected them with. "Mr. Howell, I've reviewed your nonprofit paperwork. Everything's in order. I'm calling because I showed Constance's story to my partners, and we'd like to help beyond just pro bono legal work. We're prepared to donate $10,000 to the center, plus match any donations you receive in the next month, up to another $10,000. Stanley couldn't speak. "Mr. Howell, are you there?" "Yes, I thank you. You're doing important work. Let us support it. The funds will be wired Monday. Use them well." After hanging up, Stanley showed Bridget the violation list again. "We can fix all of this and have money left over. You're going to open on schedule." "We're going to open on schedule," he corrected. "This isn't my project anymore, remember? It's ours. Constance's, yours, mine, everyone who's believed in it." Bridget smiled. "Then we'd better get to work." The next 2 weeks were a controlled sprint. Floyd installed proper emergency lighting. Marvin upgraded the fire alarm system. Dwight built compliant exit stairs. Bernice donated commercial kitchen equipment from a restaurant that had closed. Stanley bought fire extinguishers in bulk. Morris returned for re-inspection 3 days before the first classes were scheduled to begin. He walked through methodically, checking every item on his list. When he finished, he signed the occupancy permit with a flourish. "You're legal. Capacity is 75 people maximum. Don't exceed that, and we won't have problems." He shook Stanley's hand. "Good luck." "My wife's excited about that cooking class." The evening before opening, Stanley walked through the mansion alone. Scout followed as always, his nails clicking on the refinished floors. They ended in Constance's hidden room, where her journal still sat on the shelf beside the one Stanley had been keeping. He opened his journal and wrote, "Tomorrow we begin." Not the grand opening Constance envisioned, just 2 small classes with a handful of participants. But it's a beginning. The house is ready. The teachers are prepared. The students are registered. All that's left is to trust that what we've built will serve its purpose, bringing people together, helping them grow, proving that learning never stops and community never dies if Someone's willing to fight for it. He closed the journal and looked at Constance's photograph, the same one that had been framed and hung in the entryway. "We're ready," he told her. "Thank you for leaving the map. Thank you for believing someone would follow it. I hope we make you proud." Scout barked once, a sound that felt like blessing and promise combined. Outside, Millerton slept under stars and snow. Inside the mansion, rooms that had been empty for 15 years waited to be filled with voices, laughter, questions, and the quiet magic of people discovering they were capable of more than they'd believed. Tomorrow it would all begin. Not perfectly, not grandly, but genuinely, exactly as Constance had hoped. And Stanley Howell, who'd arrived 6 months ago with nothing but failure and a faithful dog, finally understood that he'd found what he'd been searching for all along. Not redemption or escape, but simply a reason to wake up each morning with purpose and gratitude. The rest would take care of itself. 6 weeks before the planned official opening, Stanley was organizing Constance's desk for permanent display in what would become the center's historical room. The desk itself was a beautiful piece. Oak with brass fittings, probably 100 years old, scarred by decades of use but fundamentally sound. He'd spent hours carefully cleaning and restoring it, treating the wood with oil until it glowed. The drawer mechanism had been sticking, so Stanley was working carefully to repair it, removing the drawer completely to inspect the slides. As he lifted the drawer from its housing, he heard something shift inside. Not just the contents, but something else, something hidden. He turned the drawer over. The bottom appeared solid, but when he pressed gently, he felt a slight give. His heart began to race. Another hidden compartment, this one built into furniture rather than walls. Scout, napping in a patch of sunlight, raised his head at Stanley's sudden stillness. Using a thin blade, Stanley carefully pried up the false bottom. Underneath lay a large manila envelope, sealed with wax that had cracked with age. On the front, in Constance's distinctive handwriting, "To whomever restores this house and my dream." Stanley's hands trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a thick document, legal papers, formal and bound. The title page read, "Last Will and Testament of Constance Eleanor Fairmont," with special trust provisions. The document was dated September 1997, more than a year before Constance's death, and bore the stamp of a notary public. Stanley read slowly, his legal knowledge limited but sufficient to grasp the implications. Constance had indeed left her entire estate in trust for the establishment and operation of a community learning center. But the specifics were more complex than anything in her journals had suggested. The trust had conditions. If a learning center was established within 30 years of her death and operated successfully for 1 calendar year, the property would transfer to a non-profit corporation governed by a 7-member community board. If no learning center was established within 30 years, the property could be sold. However, and this made Stanley's breath catch, all proceeds from any sale had to be used to establish education grants for Millerton residents, administered by the county school board in perpetuity. Constance had made it impossible for her home to ever be used for private profit. Even if her dream failed, her commitment to education would endure. But there was more. A separate section detailed the trust structure itself. Stanley read it 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding. But the language was clear. Whoever purchased the property through the town's revival program was legally a temporary custodian, not an owner. The 50-cent purchase price was symbolic, a legal mechanism to transfer custodianship, nothing more. Once the learning center opened and operated for 1 year, Stanley would have no ownership claim. The property would belong to the non-profit trust, governed by the community board. He'd been working toward giving away something that was never really his to begin with. Stanley sat heavily in Constance's chair, the document in his hands. Around him, 5 months of backbreaking work. Floors he'd refinished, walls he'd repaired, systems he'd rebuilt. Thousands of hours, and nearly all his savings poured into a building he would never own. Scout whined and pressed against his leg. "It's okay, boy," Stanley said automatically, though he wasn't sure it was. What had he been thinking? That he'd restore this mansion and somehow it would be his. That the learning center would operate, but he'd retain the building, live here, have something concrete to show for his effort. He read the document again, forcing himself to confront his own motivations. Had he been doing this for Constance's vision, or for himself? For the community or for his own redemption? The truth was uncomfortable. He'd been doing it for all those reasons, tangled together in ways he hadn't examined. Yes, he believed in Constance's dream, but he'd also been building something that was his, a project that couldn't be taken away by bad loans or economic downturns, something solid and lasting that proved Stanley Howell could still build things that mattered. Except it wouldn't be his. It would belong to everyone, which meant it belonged to no one person at all. He called an emergency meeting that evening. When the core group gathered, Gus, Floyd, Dwight, Percy, Bernice, Phyllis, Marvin, and Bridget, Stanley shared the document without preamble. The silence that followed was heavy. Floyd spoke first. "So you're doing all this work, spending all your money, for something you won't own?" "Apparently. That's insane," Percy said. "You bought it fair and square, even if it was only 50 cents. You should own it." But Gus was reading the document carefully, tears forming in his eyes. "She planned this. She knew exactly what she was doing." He looked up at Stanley. "My cousin didn't want anyone to control this place. She'd seen too many good projects become someone's ego trip or income stream. She built in protections. Protections that mean Stanley gets nothing," Floyd pointed out. "He gets everything that matters," Gus said firmly. "He gets to see Constance's dream become real. He gets to be part of something bigger than ownership." Bernice was studying Stanley's face. "How do you feel about this?" Stanley took a long breath. "Honestly shaken. I've been telling myself this project was about service, about community, about honoring Constance. But I realize now I was also building something for me. Security, purpose, a legacy I could point to. Knowing I'll have to give it up, it's harder than I expected." "You don't have to give it up," Phyllis said gently. "You just can't own it. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes," she leaned forward. "Ownership is about control, about rights and equity. What Constance is offering you is stewardship. You can be part of this center forever if you want. Teach classes, serve on the board, live here even. The trust provisions allow for a resident caretaker. You just can't sell it, can't profit from it, can't make it serve your interests over the communities." Bridget had been silent, but now she spoke. "Dad, isn't that what you've been doing anyway? You haven't been building this to sell it or profit from it. You've been building it because it matters. The only thing that's changed is now you know legally what's been true. Spiritually all along, this place belongs to something bigger than any one person." Stanley looked around the room at these people who'd become his partners, his friends, his community. They were right, of course. The work had meaning regardless of ownership. The value wasn't in property rights, but in purpose fulfilled. Still, releasing the idea of ownership hurt. He'd lost his business, his marriage, his financial security. This mansion had felt like a fresh start, a foundation he could build his life on. Learning it would never truly be his felt like another loss, stacked on top of all the others. "I need to think," he said finally. They left him alone, understanding. Even Bridget retreated to her temporary room, giving her father space. Stanley returned to Constance's hidden room and read her journals again, searching for clues to her thinking. He found an entry from 1995. "Ownership makes us possessive. We protect what's ours, even from people who might benefit from it. If this learning center is to serve everyone, it must belong to everyone, not as some abstract collective, but as a genuine trust, held by the community, governed by representatives, used for the common good. I must make it impossible for anyone, including whoever brings this dream to life, to turn it into private property. Love sometimes means giving away what we've built." Stanley closed the journal and sat in the darkness, Scout's steady breathing the only sound. "Love sometimes means giving away what we've built." He thought about his construction business. how he'd become obsessive about control, unwilling to delegate or trust partners, convinced that his tight grip was protecting his investment. That obsession had contributed to its failure. He'd been so busy protecting ownership that he'd forgotten to nurture relationships, build teams, create something sustainable. What if Constance was right? What if the very act of refusing to own this place was what would make it work? By morning, Stanley had reached a decision. He called another meeting, this time with a lawyer present, Stanford Whitley, who drove up from the city after Stanley explained the situation. Whitley reviewed the trust document carefully. This is legally sound. Ahead of its time, actually. Constance created an irrevocable trust with specific performance conditions. The Learning Center must operate successfully for 1 year, at which point the property automatically transfers to the non-profit corporation you've been setting up. What defines successful operation? Floyd asked. The document specifies regular classes held, minimum of 25 unique participants over 12 months, documented educational outcomes and financial solvency, which doesn't mean profit. Just that the center isn't operating at a destructive loss. That's achievable, Phyllis said. What happens if the center fails after transfer? Percy wanted to know. The trust includes dissolution provisions. If the non-profit fails, the property can be sold, but proceeds go to education grants. It can never revert to private ownership. Stanley listened to the discussion swirling around him, then spoke. I want to move forward. Establish the non-profit exactly as Constance outlined. Transfer the property when we meet the trust conditions. Make this place what it was always meant to be, a gift to the community. You're sure? Bridget asked. You're giving up significant property value. I'm sure. This was never about value. It was about meaning. Constance understood something I'm just learning. Some things are too important to own. Gus's eyes shone with tears. She'd be so proud of you. I hope so. Because I'm doing this on faith that she was right. That something held in trust by many is stronger than something owned by one. They spent the next hour outlining the non-profit structure. 7 board members, as Constance had specified: Gus, Floyd, Percy, Bernice, Phyllis, Marvin, and Stanley. Rotating terms, consensus decision-making, transparent finances. The board would hire a director to manage daily operations. Stanley volunteered for that role if they wanted him, but insisted it be an actual vote, not an assumption. Of course we want you, Floyd said gruffly. You built this place. Literally and figuratively. I helped build it, Stanley corrected. We all did. That's the point. As the meeting concluded, Vaughan Pritchard's name came up. Someone needed to inform him that the property wasn't for sale at any price. Not because Stanley refused, but because it legally couldn't be sold for private use. That's going to make him angry, Dwight predicted. Let him be angry, Gus said. Constance planned for people like Vaughan. She made this place untouchable by developers, preserved it for its real purpose. After everyone left, Stanley stood in the entryway, looking at Constance's framed portrait. You were playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, he told her. You knew someone would come along who'd put their whole heart into this place. And you made sure that when they did, their ego couldn't corrupt it. That's wisdom I'm only beginning to understand. Scout barked once, then trotted toward the library, where afternoon sun was streaming through windows. Stanley followed, feeling lighter than he had in months. Yes, he'd been shaken by discovering he'd never owned this building. But he'd been building it with borrowed dreams anyway. Constance's dreams, the community's dreams, dreams bigger than one man could carry alone. Letting go of ownership didn't mean letting go of purpose. It meant finally understanding that purpose and ownership were never the same thing. The official opening was 4 weeks away. Everything was ready, the rooms, the teachers, the curriculum, the legal structure. All that remained was to trust that what they'd built together would endure precisely because no single person could control or destroy it. Constance had seen clearly what Stanley was only now grasping. The strongest foundations aren't built on property rights, but on shared commitment to something worth preserving. And that, he realized, was a kind of ownership more valuable than any deed could convey. 2 weeks before the official opening, Stanley found Constance's original welcome speech tucked inside the community charter. The cards were yellowed with age, covered in her neat handwriting, notes for a speech she'd never gotten to deliver. He read them in the quiet of early morning, Scout dozing at his feet, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a mantle. A community that learns together stays together, the first card read. We gather not because we are broken, but because we are brave enough to grow. Stanley decided he would deliver this speech, adapting it slightly, but keeping Constance's voice at its heart. She deserved to be present at the opening, even if only through borrowed words. The building inspector, Maurice Sheffield, arrived unannounced that morning for a final walkthrough. This wasn't required, but Maurice had become personally invested in the project. His wife had completed Bernice's cooking class and wouldn't stop talking about it. Just want to make sure everything's ready for the crowd you're expecting, Maurice explained, clipboard in hand. They walked through every room. Maurice checked fire extinguishers, emergency exits, occupancy postings, electrical panels. He tested smoke detectors, examined handrails, verified that the commercial kitchen met health department standards. You've done this right, Maurice said finally. Better than right. Most people do the minimum to pass inspection. You've gone beyond. Shows respect for the people who'll use this space. That was always the point. Maurice paused at the historical display in the entryway, photographs of old Millerton, artifacts from the mansion's past, Constance's portrait. My grandfather worked at the mill, 42 years. When it closed, he just gave up, stopped caring about much of anything, died 5 years later. He turned to Stanley. What you're building here, it's not just a learning center. It's proof that giving up isn't the only option. After Maurice left, Bridget arrived with news. The local newspaper wants to do a feature story, and the regional TV station asked about covering the opening. We're getting attention. Is that good? Dad, yes. Attention means support, which means donations, which means sustainability. This place can't run on good intentions alone. She was right, of course. The pilot classes had been modest successes. Floyd's home repair students had learned practical skills. Bernice's cooking students had mastered budget-friendly meals. But operating costs were real. Insurance, utilities, materials, maintenance. Even with volunteer teachers, the center needed steady funding. The grant application Bridget had submitted months ago still hadn't received a response. They'd raised $18,000 through social media and Stanford Whitley's matching donation, but that would cover maybe 6 months of operation. We need to think long-term, Bridget said. Develop funding streams that don't depend on charity. Constance's plan included modest fees for non-residents. That helps, but it's not enough. We should explore partnerships, maybe the county library system, the community college, local businesses. Create a network of support. Stanley appreciated his daughter's practical mind. She'd become invaluable over the past month, handling communications, managing registrations, building the center's public presence. He couldn't imagine doing this without her. That afternoon brought unexpected drama. Stanley was painting trim in what would become the art room when he heard raised voices from downstairs. He descended quickly to find Vaughan Pritchard in the entryway, face red with anger, confronting Gus. "This is fraud," Pritchard was saying. "You can't just declare property held in trust retroactively." "Stanley bought this place legally for 50 cents, Gus interrupted calmly, "through a town program designed to encourage restoration, not ownership. The trust was established 26 years ago. Stanley was always a custodian, not an owner. The law is clear. My lawyers say otherwise." Stanley stepped forward. "Mr. Pritchard, what's this about?" Pritchard turned his anger toward Stanley. "This is about you and your little club, trying to steal property that should be available for legitimate development. I filed a complaint with the county, demanding an investigation into the legality of this supposed trust. The trust is completely legal." Stanford Whitley reviewed. "Whitley's a bleeding heart liberal who probably helped you fabricate these documents. Real lawyers, business lawyers, know this won't hold up in court." Then take it to court, Stanley said quietly. We have nothing to hide. Constance Fairmont's will was properly executed and notarized. The trust provisions are enforceable. If you want to waste your money challenging them, that's your choice. Pritchard stepped closer, his voice dropping to something more threatening. You're making a mistake. I tried to buy you out fairly. Now you're going to learn what happens when you stand in the way of real progress. Is that a threat? It's a promise. This opening you're planning, it's not going to happen. I've got friends in the county, in the state capital. One phone call and your permits get reviewed, your non-profit status gets questioned, your insurance gets expensive. I can make operating here impossible. Gus's voice was steel. Vaughn, I've known you since you were a boy. Your father was a good man who built businesses by serving people, not exploiting them. He'd be ashamed of what you've become. Pritchard's face went white with rage, but he said nothing. He stormed out, his expensive shoes echoing on the hardwood floors. Stanley found he was shaking. Scout appeared at his side, pressing close. He's bluffing, Gus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe, but what if he's not? The next morning proved Pritchard wasn't bluffing. Stanley received notification that his non-profit status was under review. A routine matter, the letter said, but it would take 60 to 90 days to resolve. Until then, the organization couldn't legally accept donations or operate as a tax-exempt entity. 2 hours later, the insurance company called. We've received information suggesting your building may not meet current safety codes. We'll need another inspection before we can maintain your policy. We just passed inspection. We understand, Mr. Howell, but we have to follow up on complaints. The inspection will be scheduled within 2 weeks. Until then, your coverage is suspended. Without insurance, they couldn't operate. Without non-profit status, they couldn't raise funds. The opening was 12 days away. Stanley called an emergency meeting. When everyone gathered, the board members plus Bridget and several volunteers, the mood was somber. Pritchard's attacking on multiple fronts, Stanley explained. He's using bureaucracy as a weapon. Even if all these challenges are baseless, they'll take months to resolve. Can we postpone the opening? Phyllis asked. And look like we're defeated by one angry developer? Floyd shook his head. That's exactly what he wants. But we can't open without insurance, Bernice pointed out. That's not pride talking, that's liability. If someone gets hurt and we're not covered, the center could be sued out of existence. They sat in frustrated silence. 6 months of work, thousands of hours and dollars, all threatened by one man's vindictive determination. Marvin spoke up. What if we don't technically open? What do you mean? What if the opening ceremony happens, but we call it a community celebration? Not an official operational launch, just an event showcasing what we've built. No classes, no formal programs, just a party. Parties don't require non-profit status or special insurance. Stanley considered this. Then when do we actually open? When the bureaucratic challenges are resolved. Could be weeks, could be months. But at least we show Pritchard he can't stop people from gathering, from celebrating, from believing in this place. It's not what we planned, Percy said slowly. But it might work. Bridget was already on her laptop. I can update all the communications. Change the language from grand opening to community celebration. Same event, different legal implications. What about the people who've registered for classes? Phyllis asked. We've got 47 people expecting to start learning in less than 2 weeks. We tell them the truth, Stanley said. We're facing temporary obstacles, but we're not giving up. Classes will start as soon as we clear the bureaucratic hurdles. Ask them to be patient. Some will drop out, Floyd predicted. Maybe, but the ones who stay are the ones who truly believe. Quality over quantity. They spent the next hour refining the plan. The celebration would proceed as scheduled. Tours of the building, refreshments, speeches, including Stanley's adaptation of Constance's welcome. They'd demonstrate what the center would offer without technically operating. A preview, not a launch. Morris Sheffield stopped by the next day with concerning news. The county's sending their own inspector. Someone complained about the electrical work. They want to re-verify everything. The electrical is perfect. Marvin's a licensed electrician, I know. And I told them that But they're coming anyway. Morris looked genuinely distressed. Stanley, I'm sorry. Someone with influence is pushing these buttons. Best I can do is be here when the county inspector comes. Vouch for the work that's been done. The county inspection was scheduled for 3 days before the celebration. Stanley, Marvin, Floyd, and Morris waited anxiously as an inspector named Gordon Yates examined every outlet, switch, and junction box. Yates was thorough and professional. After 2 hours, he signed off on the electrical work. It's excellent. Better than code, actually. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, Stanford Whitley called that evening. I've been investigating the non-profit review. It's highly unusual for a routine application to suddenly be questioned after initial approval. Someone filed a formal complaint alleging your organization is a front for private profit. That's absurd. We're giving the property away. I know, and we'll prove it. But the state moves slowly. Even an obviously false complaint takes time to investigate and dismiss. How much time? 6 to 8 weeks, minimum. Stanley thanked him and hung up, feeling defeated. They could hold a celebration, but they couldn't actually operate. All those people wanting to learn would have to wait, with no guarantee of when classes might start. Bridget found him sitting on the front porch, Scout beside him, staring at the sunset. We're still going ahead with the celebration? Yes, we owe people that much. Dad, you know this is going to work eventually, right? Pritchard can delay us, but he can't stop us. The truth is on our side. Truth doesn't always win. It does, if enough people fight for it. Bridget sat beside him. You've built something real here. Not just a building, a community. That's stronger than one man's spite. Stanley wanted to believe her. But 6 months of effort being sabotaged by bureaucratic manipulation was hard to accept philosophically. That night, he returned to Constance's room and read her journals, searching for wisdom. He found an entry from 1996. They rejected my proposal again today. The 3rd time. Each rejection hurts, but I refuse to let hurt become defeat. What matters isn't whether I succeed in my lifetime, but whether I plant seeds that can grow after I'm gone. If my dream dies with me, it was never strong enough. If it survives, it was always bigger than one person anyway. I choose to believe it will survive. Stanley closed the journal carefully. Constance had faced rejection and died before seeing her dream realized. Yet here he was, 26 years later, fighting to make that dream real. She'd been right. It had survived because it was bigger than her, bigger than him, bigger than any single person's effort. Pritchard could delay them. He couldn't destroy what Constance had planted, and Stanley had nurtured. The celebration would proceed, and afterward, however long it took, they'd open properly. Teach classes, serve the community, prove that learning centers like this could thrive. Stanley picked up the speech cards and began practicing aloud, Scout listening attentively. A community that learns together stays together. We gather not because we are broken, but because we are brave enough to grow. Constance's words, but they'd become his truth too. In 8 days, he'd stand before Millerton and deliver them. And whatever Vaughan Pritchard tried that moment, the moment Constance's voice spoke again through Stanley's, declaring that her dream lived on, that moment couldn't be taken away. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The morning of the celebration arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if even the weather had decided to bless the occasion. Stanley woke before dawn in what had become his permanent bedroom, the former library, now furnished simply but comfortably. Scout was already awake, tail wagging, sensing that today was important. They walked through the mansion together, Stanley's ritual inspection. Every room ready, every surface clean, every detail attended to. The entryway gleamed with fresh polish. The library, Phyllis's domain, had books arranged by subject, reading nooks created with donated chairs and lamps. The kitchen sparkled, ready for the community potluck. The workshop space waited with tools organized and labeled. The classrooms held chairs in welcoming circles, not rows. In the historical room, Constance's portrait hung surrounded by photographs of Millerton's past. Beside it, the bronze handbell that would signal the beginning of the ceremony. The same bell Constance's grandmother had used to call community gatherings decades ago. Gus had found it in the attic, polished it until it gleamed, and insisted Stanley use it. "Continuity matters," Gus had said. "Let the same bell that called people together, then call them together now." Bridget arrived at 7, arms full of last-minute supplies. She'd barely slept, having spent the night finalizing arrangements, confirming with caterers, preparing the guest book she'd ordered, a beautiful leather-bound volume where visitors could sign their names and share their thoughts. "How many RSVPs?" Stanley asked. 147. "But you know how these things go. Probably half that will actually show up." By 9 o'clock, cars were already arriving. Stanley watched from the front porch, his heart in his throat. 10 people became 20, then 50. By 10:30, when the ceremony was scheduled to begin, over 200 people crowded the lawn and filled the first-floor rooms. People from Millerton, yes, but also neighboring towns. Former residents who'd moved away but returned for this occasion. Reporters from 3 different newspapers. A camera crew from the regional television station. And faces Stanley didn't recognize. People who'd followed the project on social media, who'd donated, who wanted to see this dream made real. Gus appeared at Stanley's elbow, eyes wide. "I never imagined Constance would be overwhelmed." "She'd be proud," Stanley corrected. "This is exactly what she hoped for." They ushered people into the main hall, where chairs had been arranged in a semicircle. The 7 board members sat on a small platform, not elevated much, just enough to be visible. The bronze bell sat on a small table beside the podium, catching the morning light. When every seat was filled and people lined the walls and sat on the floor, Stanley stood. His hands were trembling, so he gripped the podium to steady himself. Scout, wearing his service vest, lay at the platform's edge, calm and watchful. Stanley lifted the bell and rang it 3 times. The clear, bright sound cut through the murmur of conversation, bringing instant silence. The same sound that had called people to gather here in 1960, in 1975, in 1988, before the mill closed, before hope faded, before Millerton forgot what community meant. "Thank you for coming," Stanley began, his voice catching slightly. He cleared his throat and continued. 6 months ago, I arrived in Millerton with nothing but a failed business, a broken marriage, and a dog who was smarter than I was. I bought this mansion for 50 cents because I had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose." He paused, looking around at the faces. Some he knew, most he didn't. All of them attentive, present here. "I thought I was buying a house to fix and maybe sell for a small profit. What I found instead was a hidden room filled with journals belonging to Constance Fairmont, the last person to live here. Those journals contained a dream, a vision of this mansion as a place where people could come together to learn, to grow, to remember that it's never too late to become more than we were." Stanley picked up Constance's speech cards, his hands steadier now. Constance wrote a welcome speech for the learning center she hoped to create. She never got to deliver it. "With your permission, I'd like to share her words now." He read from the cards, his voice taking on the rhythm of Constance's careful phrasing. "A community that learns together, stays together. We gather not because we are broken, but because we are brave enough to grow. No one here is better or lesser. We are all students. We are all teachers. We bring what we have and take what we need." The room was absolutely silent. Stanley continued, "This house was built to shelter family. Today we make it shelter community. These walls will witness courage. The courage to admit we want to learn, to change, to be better. The courage to say we don't know something, but we're willing to try. The courage to fail and try again, to grow old but never stop growing." He set down the cards and spoke his own words now. "Constance never saw this day, but she believed someone would finish her work. I thought that someone was me. I was wrong. That someone is all of us." Stanley gestured to the crowd. "This isn't Stanley Howell Center. It's not even Constance Fairmont's anymore. It belongs to Millerton, to every person willing to walk through those doors, seeking growth. Under the terms of Constance's will, once this center operates successfully for 1 year, it transfers to a non-profit trust governed by community members. I don't own this building. You do. Collectively, we'll succeed or fail together. He introduced each board member briefly. Gus stood to scattered applause, his eyes wet. Floyd received knowing nods from hardware store customers. Percy got a whoop from his granddaughter, who'd come home for this day. Bernice was greeted with warm smiles. Phyllis, Marvin, and Stanley completed the circle. Some of you know we're facing obstacles, Stanley continued. Bureaucratic challenges that will delay our official opening. We can't start classes yet, but we can celebrate what's been built. We can commit to this vision. We can prove that Constance's dream didn't die with her. It was just waiting for the right moment to bloom. He rang the bell 3 times again. The Constance Fairmont Community Learning Center isn't open yet, but it will be. This I promise you. And when it is, these doors will welcome everyone who wants to learn, regardless of age or background, or how many times they've failed before. Because Constance taught me something essential. Broken things can be made whole. Lost dreams can wake again, and it's never, ever too late to become who we were meant to be. The applause began slowly, then built to something powerful. People stood, and the ovation continued for what felt like minutes. Stanley stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed, seeking air. Bridget found him in Constance's room, where he'd retreated. "Dad, you okay? I didn't expect all those people. You gave them hope. That's what they came for." Through the window, Stanley could see people touring the grounds, children playing on the lawn, adults engaged in animated conversations. The scene looked like the photographs from Millerton's past. Community gathered, connected, alive. "Your mother called," Bridget said quietly. "She saw the news coverage this morning. She wanted me to tell you she's proud of what you've built." Stanley's throat tightened. Loretta's approval shouldn't matter anymore, but somehow it did. Not because he wanted her back, but because it meant something, that she could see he'd become someone worth being proud of again. "Tell her thank you," Bridget hesitated. "There's something else. Preston's here." "What?" "Your son flew in this morning. Wanted to surprise you. He's downstairs." Stanley descended quickly, searching the crowd. Then he saw him. Preston, 24, and looking so much like Stanley had at that age, standing in the entryway with tears streaming down his face. They embraced without words. When Preston finally pulled back, he said simply, "Dad, this is incredible. You did this. We did this. All of us. No, you started it. You had the courage to try when everyone said you were crazy. That's everything." The afternoon dissolved into tours, conversations, and the community potluck Bernice had organized. Tables on the front lawn sagged under the weight of dishes. Casseroles, salads, desserts, enough food to feed twice the people present. Stanley moved through the crowd in a daze, accepting congratulations, answering questions, watching scout charm everyone he encountered. At some point, Gus pulled him aside to the guestbook Bridget had placed in the entryway. "Read these," Gus said. Stanley opened to the first page. Entry after entry, people sharing their reactions. "This is what hope looks like. Thank you. My grandmother attended community gatherings here in 1960. She would be so proud. I forgot Millerton had a heart. Today I remembered. Constance, you did it. Rest well." Stanley closed the book gently, unable to speak. Scout pressed against his leg, offering comfort. "She's here," Gus whispered. "I feel her in every corner." Stanley nodded. He felt her too, in the walls they'd restored, the rooms they'd prepared, the community that had gathered. Constance Fairmont's dream was alive finally, after 26 years of waiting. And that was worth every obstacle still to come. As the celebration continued into the afternoon, Stanley noticed a woman hovering at the edge of the crowd. She was perhaps in her late 40s, dressed simply, her expression uncertain. She kept glancing toward the building, then looking away, as if battling some internal debate. Stanley approached her gently. "Welcome. I'm Stanley Howell. I know who you are." Her voice was soft, hesitant. "I'm Denise Waverly. I registered for the literacy class, the one that was supposed to start next week. I'm so sorry about the delay. We're working through some bureaucratic issues, but I can't read very well, Denise said in a rush, as if forcing the words out before courage failed. Never learned properly. Too ashamed to ask for help before. My kids don't even know. I've been hiding it my whole adult life. Stanley's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her voice. Denise, I promise you, the moment we're clear to operate, that class will happen. And you'll be the first person I call. What if it takes months? What if I lose my nerve? Tears gathered in her eyes. It took everything I had to register, to admit I needed help. Now I have to wait, and I'm afraid if I wait too long, I'll talk myself out of it again. Before Stanley could respond, Phyllis appeared at his elbow. She'd overheard the conversation. Denise, I'm Phyllis Drummond. I'll be teaching that literacy class. Can we talk for a moment? She led Denise to a quiet corner, while Stanley watched, grateful for Phyllis's instinctive compassion. 10 minutes later, both women emerged. Denise's expression transformed. What did you say to her? Stanley asked Phyllis quietly. That courage doesn't wait for perfect timing. That if she's ready to learn, I'm ready to teach. Bureaucracy be damned. We'll meet privately until the official class can start. Just her and me working through the basics, Phyllis smiled. Sometimes the rules need to bend for the person in front of you. Stanley felt something shift in his chest. This was what Constance had understood. Education wasn't about institutions or official programs. It was about connection between someone willing to teach and someone brave enough to learn. He circulated through the crowd, listening to conversations. Near the workshop, a young man named Kieran Douglas was in animated discussion with Floyd about carpentry techniques. I lost my job 6 months ago, Kieran was explaining. Can't afford trade school. When your class starts, will you really teach Finnish carpentry? I'll teach you everything I know, Floyd promised. And when you're ready, I'll help you find work. Good carpenters are always needed. In the library, an elderly couple examined the collection with wonder. We haven't had access to books since the county closed the library, the woman said to anyone listening. We've missed reading more than I can say. Everywhere Stanley looked, he saw the same thing, people hungry for what this place offered. Not charity or condescension, but opportunity and connection. The chance to grow, to learn, to become more than circumstance had allowed. Late afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Vaughan Pritchard arrived alone, parking at the edge of the lawn. He didn't approach the crowd, but stood watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. Stanley considered ignoring him, then decided confrontation was overdue. He walked over, Scout at his side. Vaughan. Stanley. Pritchard's tone lacked its usual hostility. He gestured at the celebration. Impressive turnout. People want this. So I see. Pritchard was silent for a long moment, watching children play on the lawn, adults engaged in earnest conversation. My father used to bring me here when I was young. Constance's parents hosted summer gatherings. I remember thinking this place was magical. Stanley waited, surprised by the confession. After the mill closed, after everyone left or gave up, I convinced myself that Millerton needed to become something different. Tear down the old, build something new, profitable. Pritchard's jaw tightened. But watching this today, I'm wondering if I was wrong. If maybe what the town needed was to remember what it used to be. It's not too late to support what we're building. I've already filed the complaints. Set things in motion. I'm not sure I can stop them even if I wanted to. You could try. Pritchard looked at Stanley directly. You're not going to accept my buyout offer, are you? No matter what I threaten or how much I increase the price. The property's not mine to sell. It belongs to the community. That was always Constance's plan. And you're fine with that? Building something you'll never own? Stanley looked back at the mansion, at the people gathered in celebration of a dream 26 years in the making. I'm building something better than ownership. I'm building meaning. There's a difference. Pritchard nodded slowly, something like respect in his eyes. My father would have liked you. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I hope you succeed. The complaints I filed, I'll see what I can do about withdrawing them. No promises, but I'll try. He left before Stanley could respond, his expensive SUV disappearing down the hill. Did that just happen? Bridget appeared, having witnessed the exchange. I think Vaughan Pritchard just became an ally. or at least stopped being an enemy. Dad, do you know what this means? If he withdraws his complaints, the non-profit review resolves faster. The insurance issues disappear. We could open within weeks instead of months. Stanley felt hope surge, then forced himself to temper it. He said no promises, but he said he'd try. That's more than we had an hour ago. As the sun began setting, people slowly departed, promising to return for the official opening whenever it happened. The Corps volunteers stayed to clean up, working together to restore order to the mansion and grounds. Gus pulled Stanley aside as they carried folding chairs to storage. I've been thinking about what you said in your speech, about how Constance's dream didn't die, it was just waiting. That's beautiful, Stanley, and true. I meant every word. I know you did. That's why this is going to work. Because you understand that some things are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, even when the original dreamer is gone. Gus's voice cracked. Thank you for finishing what my cousin started. Thank you for believing her vision mattered. It mattered more than she ever knew. That evening, after everyone had left, Stanley sat on the front porch with Scout, Preston, and Bridget. The mansion glowed with warm light from every window. Inside, every room bore evidence of the day's celebration. Guest book filled with entries, refreshment tables emptied, chairs arranged in welcoming circles. What happens next? Preston asked. We wait for the bureaucracy to clear. Keep the momentum going. Stay ready? Stanley scratched Scout's ears. And we trust that what we've built is strong enough to survive whatever obstacles remain. It is, Bridget said with certainty. Did you see those people today? They believe in this place. Belief like that doesn't quit. Stanley thought about Denise Waverley, brave enough to admit she needed help. About Kieran Douglas, hoping for skills that could change his life. About the elderly couple who missed reading. About hundreds of people who'd gathered to celebrate something that wasn't even officially open yet. Constance was right, he said quietly. Community doesn't die if someone keeps believing. It just goes dormant, waiting for the right moment to bloom again. Preston leaned against his father's shoulder. I'm proud of you, Dad. Not for the building, though that's impressive. For becoming the person who could do this. That's the real transformation. Stanley felt tears prick his eyes. His children were here, believing in him. His ex-wife had offered her pride. His volunteers had become family. A town that had mocked him now called him friend. He'd come to Millerton 6 months ago, broken and desperate. He was leaving that person behind, not because his circumstances had changed, but because his purpose had. He'd found something worth building, worth fighting for, worth giving away. And in giving it away, he'd gained everything that mattered. Scout barked once, looking up at the stars emerging overhead. I know, boy, Stanley said. We did good today. Inside the mansion, in the hidden room where it had all started, Constance's journal sat on their shelf beside Stanley's own growing record. 2 stories, 2 dreamers, 1 vision that refused to die. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight was for gratitude, for celebration, for acknowledging that impossible things sometimes happen when stubborn people refuse to quit. Millerton's heart was beating again. And Stanley Howell had helped restart it, 1 restored room and 1 kept promise at a time. 3 months after the celebration, autumn returned to Millerton with a painter's palette of gold and amber. Stanley stood in the mansion's front yard, watching volunteers prepare the ground for a tree planting ceremony, the final symbolic gesture before the centre's first anniversary and official property transfer to the community trust. The oak sapling waited in its burlap wrap, purchased with funds donated specifically for this purpose. It would outlive everyone present, growing tall and strong while generations came to learn in the building's shadow. The intervening months had been transformative. Vaughan Pritchard had indeed withdrawn his complaints, though he'd never formally explained why. The non-profit status was reinstated within 3 weeks. Insurance coverage resumed. And on a cold January morning, the Constance Fairmont Community Learning Centre had officially opened its doors. 89 people had registered for the first full semester of classes. Floyd's advanced home repair course was always full. Bernice's cooking program had expanded to 2 sections. Phyllis's reading groups met 3 times weekly. Percy taught woodworking to eager students, including his granddaughter, who'd moved back to Millerton to be closer to family and opportunity. New classes had been added based on community input, basic computer skills taught by Marvin's wife, financial planning led by a retired banker, gardening instruction from Dwight, and local history seminars conducted by Gus that had become unexpectedly popular. The state grant Bridget had applied for, the one they'd nearly forgotten, had been approved, providing $75,000 annually for 3 years. Combined with modest fees from non-residents and steady donations, the center was financially stable. Not wealthy, but sustainable. Stanley had been hired as executive director by unanimous board vote, a paid position that allowed him to dedicate himself fully to the center's growth. He lived in 2 rooms on the 3rd floor, resident caretaker, as Constance's trust had allowed. Scout had free run of the building and had become the unofficial mascot, beloved by students and visitors alike. Now, watching more than 200 people gather for the tree planting, Stanley marveled at how much had changed. The same crowd that had attended the celebration, but this time they came not as curious spectators, but as participants. These were students, teachers, volunteers, and believers in what this place represented. Gus stood beside him, leaning on a cane he'd recently started using. At 84, his health was declining, but his spirit remained fierce. "She's here, you know," Gus said, gazing at the mansion. "I feel Constance in every room, every class. Every moment someone discovers they can learn something new. I feel her too." The ceremony began with the 7 board members gathered around the sapling. Gus spoke first, his voice wavering but clear. "This tree represents permanence in a world that values the temporary. It will grow slowly, steadily, offering shade and shelter long after we're gone. Like education, like community, like love, the most valuable things take time to mature." Each board member placed a handful of soil around the tree's roots. Children from visiting families helped water it, their laughter bright in the cool morning air. A plaque was installed beside the tree, planted in honor of Constance Fairmont and the Millerton community. "May we always grow toward the light." Stanley spoke last, keeping his remarks brief. "This tree will outlive all of us. Decades from now, people will sit in its shade, perhaps not knowing why it's here. But it will represent this moment, when a community chose to grow together. When we decided that giving up isn't the only option. When we remembered that it's never too late to learn, to change, to become more than we were." Afterward, the celebration moved inside for the first official alumni gathering. People who'd completed classes shared their successes. Denise Waverley, now reading confidently at a 6th grade level, brought books she'd finished and couldn't stop talking about. Kieran Douglas displayed a jewelry box he'd crafted in Percy's woodworking class, its dovetail joints perfect. A woman who'd learned financial planning had saved enough for a down payment on a house. A man who'd completed computer training had landed a remote job that let him stay in Millerton. The stories multiplied. Small victories, large transformations, proof that Constance's vision worked. Late afternoon found Stanley alone in Constance's room, preparing for his final task of the day. Tomorrow, the property would officially transfer to the non-profit trust. Stanley would sign papers releasing any claim to ownership, and the Constance Fairmont Community Learning Center would belong fully and legally to the community. He opened his journal, the one he'd been keeping since the beginning, and wrote a final entry. "Tomorrow, this building stops being something I restored and becomes something we sustain together. I came to Millerton 6 months ago seeking escape. I found purpose instead. I thought I was honoring a dead woman's dream. Instead, I discovered she'd left a map for people like me, lost, searching, needing to build something that matters. Constance, we did it. Scout and I and Gus and Floyd and everyone who believed. Your dream lives. The center thrives. The town remembers what community means. And I've learned that legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about making tomorrow better than today. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for believing someone would come. Thank you for teaching me that the best things we build are the ones we give away." He closed the journal and placed it beside Constance's on the shelf. two records of faith, separated by decades, but united in purpose. Scout appeared in the doorway, graying around his muzzle, but still vigilant, still faithful. "Ready, boy?" They walked to the front porch, Stanley's favorite spot for evening reflection. The oak sapling stood small but sturdy in the yard, its leaves rustling in the breeze. Lights glowed warm in the mansion's windows. People were inside, cleaning up after the ceremony, laughing and talking. Bridget had moved permanently to Millerton, teaching writing workshops and managing the center's communications. Preston visited monthly, each time staying longer, considering whether he might relocate too. The family that had scattered was finding new ways to connect. Maurice Sheffield arrived for the evening ESL class he'd enrolled in. His wife had convinced him they should learn Spanish together. He waved to Stanley before heading inside. Floyd's truck pulled up, Bernice in the passenger seat. They'd become inseparable, two lonely people finding companionship in shared purpose. They were teaching a joint class now. Home repairs and comfort cooking, skills that made a house a home. Gus emerged from his car slowly, Phyllis helping him navigate the steps. "Stanley, you come into the board meeting." "Be right there." Stanley stood for one more moment, taking it all in. The building that had been a ruin now served as Millerton's heart. The town that had been dying was learning to live again. The man who'd been broken had been made whole, not by fixing himself, but by helping fix something larger. Scout pressed against his leg, grounding him in the present moment. "Good boy," Stanley whispered. "Such a good boy. None of this happens without you." Inside, the board was gathering for their monthly meeting. They'd discuss expansion plans, new class proposals, fundraising strategies. Routine business for an organization that had moved from dream to reality. Stanley took one last look at the oak sapling, silhouetted against the sunset. Small now, but growing. Like trust, like community, like hope carefully tended. He'd bought this mansion for 50 cents and discovered it was worth everything. Not in money, but in meaning, in purpose, in the quiet satisfaction of building something that would outlast him. Scout barked once, impatient. "I'm coming." They went inside together, Stanley closing the door on the fading day. But not closing off possibility, never that. The door would open again tomorrow, and the next day, and for years to come. Open to anyone brave enough to walk through and admit they wanted to grow. That was Constance's gift. A house transformed into a home for learning, a building that belonged to everyone, a dream that refused to die because it was bigger than any one person's life. And Stanley Howell, who'd arrived in Millerton with nothing but failure and a faithful dog, had learned the most important lesson of all. Second chances are real when we're brave enough to take them. The town that had mocked him now called him friend, neighbor, and teacher. Scout's discovery had changed everything, but Stanley's choice